Hello and welcome to Premier Unbelievable. I'm Luke Martin and today I'm with Dr. Lee Warren. Lee was a practicing neurosurgeon, has been one for 25 years. He's an Iraq War veteran, a trauma survivor, an author and a podcaster. Lee, very welcome to the show.
Thank you, Luke. It's an honor to be with you today, my friend.
So Lee, you performed, having to look at the stats here, you performed over 200 brain surgeries in 125 days in Iraq. Can you tell us about that? It's a pretty mind-boggling stat for non-specialists, at least.
Yeah, I was in the United States Air Force and was deployed to the Iraq War in support of that mission to help combat injured troops and also injured civilians and even enemy combatants. And we spent 4 months there, survived 100 mortar and rocket attacks, and did 200 brain surgery in that environment. And it was obviously a very deep immersion into trauma surgery, but also into trauma. Not only dealing with people who were hurt, but we were in danger and getting exposed to rockets and mortars and scary things. And so I came home from the war fairly rattled, actually.
Okay, so tell us a bit more about that. I'm just fascinating. What's it like? So performing these surgeries, what's the setup like? I mean, are you in a tent or are you in a well prepped building? How does it work?
Well, it was a tent. It was a series of tents that were sort of connected by little hallways, and then the operating rooms were manufactured little trailers that had hard walls, so at least we had some protection there. And they were just basically connected together in a way that we could perform surgery on up to 8 people at the same time. We had all kinds of different specialists, plastic surgeons, orthopedists, general surgeons, ear, nose, and throat, neurosurgery, obviously. And you never knew what was going to come in off the helicopter. So they would bring in 20 or 30 blown up people or shot people all at the same time. And we were often having to perform multiple types of surgery on an individual at the same time. So somebody would have a limb that was blown off and an open head injury and a general surgery wound, and 3 or 4 or 5 of us would be working on somebody at the same time. So it was quite chaotic, but we got really good at working together, and over the course of that time there, everybody became pretty well systematized, so it got really efficient.
And so 200 and 125 days, what would a sort of normal brain surgeon be doing? I mean, how different was that to your usual day-to-day professional life?
Yeah, so in normal practice, trauma is not the most common thing that you do. We have people with back pain and ruptured discs and headaches and all kinds of different things that we're taking care of. And normally I would perform 3 or 4 surgeries in a day in my normal civilian practice. And in Iraq, it could be 15 surgeries in 12 hours, or it could be 0. You never knew what was going to come in or when it was going to come in. It was 24 hours a day, constantly waiting for the call to come in that somebody was hurt. And so in the United States, during peacetime, we have a schedule, right? We see somebody in the office and we operate on them 6 weeks later. But in that environment, it's every moment is something new. It's quite interesting.
So you say, I think you use the word rattled. You were sort of rattled when you returned from that. Did I hear you right?
Yeah, I was shaken up. I struggled with what I now know to be PTSD for several years. I was startled by loud noises and sort of would go into almost a trance. Sometimes if I saw a helicopter or something pass by, I would sort of go flashback to the war and dealt with nightmares and all of those things. And it took me a long time to sort of figure out what my brain was doing to me.
So were you able to sort of self-diagnose pretty quickly that was PTSD?
No, actually, as it turned out, I got home from the war and was separated from the service really quickly after that. So I started a new civilian practice and had also gone through a divorce in my first marriage around the same time that I was deployed. And so when I came home, I got really busy trying to reconnect with my kids, but also start my practice. And so I sort of put all that Iraq War business away off to the side and just didn't process it for a long time. And it was about 4 years later when it kind of started coming out unexpectedly. And that's when I went into it and the throes of it, years after I had been in the middle of it. So I kind of just worked and and put all of it away and got really busy and then got remarried to Lisa and we blended our families and we started a business and did all these things. And then in 2010, 4.5 years after I got home, it just started and it was really dramatic and really painful for me to try to figure out what was happening. Um, and I was quite surprised by it as a neuroscientist, as somebody who understands how the brain works. I didn't expect to have that happen to me in my own life.
So you had 4.5 years. Would you say that those were pretty normal years, those years between the war and when you started to experience these symptoms?
I think so. It was pretty normal, and like I said, just really busy. So I never processed all of it because
Mm.
I engaged myself in other things and stayed so focused on you know trying to repair my relationship with my kids and trying to start a practice and trying to get a blended family going and all of that, and also try to figure out where my faith sat in the middle of all the things I'd experienced in the war. And we saw some really horrible things and some terrible things that people do to each other. And it took a while to process and understand that. So then when it all kind of roared out of my into my mental health and my awareness, all those things sort of jumbled up at the same time to be dealt with.
It's fascinating. I mean, that it sort of it sat there for so long, 4.5 years before it came back. Is that common? You'll know as a I guess as a doctor whether that happens
I
to a lot
think
of
it is
people.
pretty common. I think especially in people that don't talk about it or sort of keep it walled off and you sort of compartmentalize your life and think about other things. And for me, what happened was we were driving one day. Well, let me back up. We were watching television one night, and a television show came on about the Iraq War, and it was a show about these combat medics who were taking care of wounded soldiers on the battlefield. And as they loaded these guys into the helicopter, one of them said, "We're going to Balad," which is where I had been. And I turned to my wife and I said, "They're going to my hospital. They're taking people to where I was at." And then that night was the first night I had a nightmare about the war. Like it came that television show triggered that flashback.
Wow.
And then every day after that, something new would start happening. And a couple days after, I saw a helicopter fly by while we were stopped at a red light, and my wife shook me and said, "Hey, you blanked out there for about 30 seconds. You were just sitting there." And it was the helicopter. Kind of took me back to Iraq, and that's when it all came roaring out. And it turns out that that's pretty common that people have some sort of triggering event that brings it up from the subconscious and into their active mind, and they start dealing with it.
Wow. Fascinating. And we'll get into that as we go through today, as we start to talk about consciousness, subconscious, all that sort of stuff. So let's just get more of your life story on the table because it's fascinating and you've written about it. So you you wrote that things were starting to get very difficult. Um, you said your life was unraveling when you got back. Is that just the PTSD, or was there other stuff going on for you when you
Well, I think it
got
was
back?
sort of dealing with a 16-year-old marriage that had ended and unraveling that and trying to reconnect with my kids. And I moved from, we lived in Texas when I deployed, and they moved to Alabama while I was gone. And so I had to come back and move to another state to try to be close to my kids. And so my whole world kind of turned upside down. I was in the military and then I was out and I was married and then I wasn't. And I lived in Texas and then I lived in Alabama. So it was sort of everything was new. And that created this busyness that I think kept me from really getting into the understanding what I'd experienced in the war for so long.
Hmm. And then you write that you had this personal tragedy then in 2013. Do you want
Yeah.
to tell us about that?
Yeah. So as it turns out, like I said, we blended our families and we were going well. Everything was going really good in my practice and my marriage, and my kids were happy, and we were all doing pretty well. And then right as I started to think about the rest of my life looking really positive, on August the 13th of or August the 20th of 2013. My 19-year-old son Mitchell was stabbed to death and died unexpectedly, and um, we were sort of thrown into this situation of being bereaved parents, which you never, as a parent, you never expect that sort of thing to happen. And so it was quite shocking, but also devastating. And I had, as a Christian, even though I'd been through hard things before, obviously with the war and divorce, I somehow never thought about losing one of my children. Like, it came as a complete surprise to me that that could happen. which is also sort of funny because as a neurosurgeon, I deal with that with other people all the time. I see people that lose their kids in accidents constantly and get brain tumors and kids get sick and die and all that. But I somehow never had thought that that could happen to us.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's dramatic. So it was due to criminal activity. Yeah, that's that's really quite something. And how did that then affect the state that you were in? How did it affect your mental health? How did it affect your faith at the time?
Yeah, all the above. I mean, it really thrust us into this deep sort of woundedness and anxiety, and you start worrying about the future and if your other kids are going to be okay. And then now, you never thought about being able to lose one, and now you worry about losing all of them. So now it's possible, right? Now it's in your mind that you can lose a child. And we had our first grandchild by then, and or at the same time. That, in fact, our first grandchild was born on the day we buried Mitch, and so now we had a baby in the family, and there was all this fear. Like I started having all these um, unreasonable fears of losing people or people being in danger, and so the mental health side of grief and anxiety became really real to me, and then the faith issue is, God somehow helped me manage the war and survive that and helped me get through all the previous hard things. And we thought we'd done everything right and we were on the right path. And now all of a sudden we've lost a child and you're really angry with God and you don't understand why and don't understand how good God could let those kinds of things happen. And it really jumbled my faith up.
Hmm. So it really exposed you to the problem of suffering again.
Yeah.
Did you find some resolution to that?
Well, it took a long time. And actually, this is when I started writing books, was trying to process and understand all these things. And um, really, it took a long time for me to start being able to feel like I could trust God. But at the same time, it was my need to believe in the resurrection and that there's a future reconciliation of the family and all of that. I really needed to believe that that was true. And so I started searching for promises that related to that. And then I realized the verses that talk about how God is the same yesterday and today and forever, and that all of his promises are true. I figured if the resurrection promise was true, then all the other ones had to be true too. So then I started searching for immediate help and verses like Psalm 34:18, where God promises that he's um, close to the brokenhearted. I started looking for that and finding it. I'd find people would show up right in my worst moment with a kind word or a text message, or Lisa would walk into the room right when I was suffering the most, and it just sort of felt like God being close. And so I started trying to grab little promises that one by one began to help me to have hope that someday it would all be better. And then that began kind of the reconciliation of my faith with what had happened. And then I think my mental health, as I started to understand the difference between the mind and the brain and some of the neuroscience things that I was learning as a practicing neurosurgeon, I started to be able to put those two worlds together, my practice and my faith, and maybe could find a path forward again.
So you've said this line, I've seen the end of you, to patients who have terminal diagnoses. What did you mean by that? And when you were going through all these experiences, all these tragic experiences, was there a sense that you were seeing that in yourself at all?
Yeah, so that line came from, as a practicing neurosurgeon, I often see people with brain cancers, and there's a particular type of brain tumor called glioblastoma, and it's basically always fatal. The 5-year survival rate is something like 1 in 10,000. So if you get that diagnosis, it's pretty clear you have about 16 months on average that you're going to live. And so as a Christian, I was a practicing neurosurgeon, but also a Christian. I would see that scan even before I met the patient. I would see the scan, and I would recognize what it was, and I would say to myself, "Well, I've seen the end of this person. I know what's going to happen to this guy or this lady." And I could just sort of project the chemotherapy and the surgery and the tumor coming back and the things I would say to their spouse, and when the battle would be lost. I could just sort of see it all playing out in my mind. And then as I began to actually work with that patient, I understood how important it is to have hope and to fight and to keep your spirits up, because having a good peace of mind allows you to have a higher quality of life. Having hope allows you to maintain a quality of life even if your body's failing. So I knew it was important to help people hold on and pray and not give up and all that stuff. And I felt this conundrum because I didn't believe they were going to survive, but I needed to give them
Mm.
hope to fight on anyway, because some people do survive. That 1 in 10,000 could be you. I mean, you could be that person that makes it. And if you're going to be, you've got to have the right attitude. You got to fight it. You got to go through all the treatments. You got to believe that it's possible and all that stuff. And so I would say to myself, I've seen the end of this person. And then at the same time, I would say, but wait, the Bible says God can heal, God can deliver, that you're supposed to trust. And so I was trying to understand that two-sided problem when I think I know something, but I'm also supposed to have faith that God can know more than I do. And that actually, I was writing a book about that, which turned into I've seen the interview. I was writing that book when Mitch died, so it was sort of this preparation of helping other people deal with their hardest moments when I became the guy who was going through his hardest moment.
What would you say someone who's listening or watching, and because we're a mixture of Christians and maybe curious non-Christians who follow us here at Premier, what would you say to somebody who's really struggling? They feel like, they're at the end, um, psychologically, physically. What sort of messages do you give people, perhaps drawing on your own experience?
I think the most important thing is I did extensive research on the responses that people have to finding out that they're going through something hard and what they do and how they turn out. And what I learned is there are some people that would say that they have a lot of faith or a lot of hope, or they're generally optimistic people, and when they encounter a hard circumstance or a difficult diagnosis, they sort of crash and they end up in this place where they're miserable and hopeless and scared and afraid. And some of those people, even if they survive their illness, they never really get better. They're still bitter, they're still angry, they're still afraid.
Mm.
Messes up their mental health. And so I saw those people who were kind of okay until something hard happened, and then they were never okay again, even if they survived it. And then I saw other people who were down and out and maybe never okay before they got sick. And then something happened, like a sickness or an illness or a terminal diagnosis, and they somehow found what their life was about while they were dying. So these people that sort of came alive
Mm.
in the face of adversity. And what I figured out is that your quality of life is needs to be independent of the circumstances of your life. In other words, you need to sort of know what makes you tick and what you believe in and what you hope for.
Mm.
And and you need to understand what the mission and purpose of your life is, regardless of the circumstances that happen around you, because all of us are going to go through those hard things. Everybody dies, everybody gets sick, everybody has something bad that happens in their family. And if you define your happiness or your purpose based on things going a certain way for you, then that stuff can be taken from you. That quality of life can be taken from you. But if you define your quality based on things that can't be taken from you, then you can stay okay even in the face of tremendous adversity. And so I would say that the thing is, figure out some things that you believe and know to be true in your life and detach them from the circumstances and the outcome. Because you can have a high quality and high purpose filled life, even if it's shorter than you thought it was going to be, or even if it's more difficult than you thought it was going to be. And that turns out to be the thing that gives people the ability to hang in there no matter what happens to them.
That is fascinating. So are we talking about things like gratitude, trying to be grateful for what you have despite
Yeah.
circumstances? Would that be an example?
Exactly, gratitude and what your belief system is, and the understanding that the purpose of your life isn't about how long your life is. It's about the impact that you have on others, or whatever it is that you find value in. And for Christians, of course, it's serving God and enjoying Him and trying to help other people find their way to the truth and those kinds of things. And those things don't depend on how long you live or how easy your circumstances are.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. And in a sense, you can almost get that stuff in order before, for someone whose things are okay at the moment, if you can get that in order now, then when the tough times hit, then, yeah, a bit like developing virtues, trying to
Yeah,
become the sort of person that when things happen, you can deal with them, becoming courageous, compassionate, grateful, forgiving, etc.
exactly.
So you don't turn bitter. You give the example of people who just end up bitter. Yeah,
Yeah.
developing those virtues now. Yeah. And when we're thinking about this problem of suffering, are there any of the sort of the classic responses to suffering that you find yourself appealing to when you're trying to explain it? Or do you tend to go for more of a personal approach? I mean, like a sort of soul making or free will or anything like that.
Well, I think the go-to for everybody is, why would God let this kind of thing happen? You know, why if there's a good God, why would negative things happen like this? Or I can't believe in a God because hardship happens and all those kinds of things. So for me, being a person of faith, I naturally went to those places. But then I realized, I had an insight one day, like, if I'm going to blame God for all the adverse circumstances of my life, I need to be willing to credit him for the good things too, and start stacking up those things. And overall, the balance in my life has been very positive. I've got a lot of things to be grateful for. I have other children and grandchildren now, and even though I've lost a child, that life of my son for 19 years was incredibly valuable to me. And I can still find the ability to honor him and inspire other people with his loss. And so my response to adversity always tends to go towards how it affects me. And then pretty soon, if I can zoom out, I realize that it's not all about me. And that helps me to kind of put it in perspective.
Do you feel like you've come through most of these difficulties that you've explained to us? Or do you feel like you're on the other end of them?
I don't think there is an end, Luke, to grief. I think grief, at least properly experienced, is this ability to develop a perspective that says that multiple things can be true at the same time. Like, and I don't think it's true that you ever get over losing a child or get over losing your spouse. I think it's what's true is that you begin to understand that your life has a lot more elements in it than that one thing. That one thing can't define your life. And so I can get just as desperate and sad and angry about losing Mitch 5 minutes from now as I did 12 years ago.
Mm.
Sometimes it comes on and sometimes it washes over you. And, you know, on birthdays and holidays, especially, and things like that. We just had Mitch's birthday last week, and it always lands on you. You know, he'd be 32 now, and what would his kids be like? And what would his family be like? And you get into this kind of grieving moment. But then you also have these sort of ability to project, like, well, I can imagine the kind of family he would have, and I can imagine
Mm.
the kind of children he would have, and how funny they would be, and all that, and that gratitude for his life can begin to not replace the depth of the loss, but to sit alongside it, and you can sort of let two things be true at the same time.
Mm. I hear that. I think my sense was between Iraq and then the death of your son. It feels like there was sort of a crisis, some points of crisis in that period. Um, my I guess my sense is you've come through the crisis. Would that
I think
be
that's
true?
fair. I think it comes to a place where it doesn't crush you, and it doesn't become the defining thing of your life anymore. It just comes back and you feel it again. But you can feel it in the context of the rest of your life, instead of it being in that early phase of grief. It's sort of the only thing you can feel and the only thing that's true at that time. And then what saves you is recognizing that all these other things are still true and always have been still true.
Thanks, Lee. We're going to take a break now. We'll be back in a minute or two. We need to take a short break. Make sure you're following us on social media. That's at UnbelievableFE on X and at Premier Unbelievable on Instagram, Facebook, and on YouTube if you're watching rather than just listening. And if you're enjoying this new show, do leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back after a short break.
We are launching a brand new course which helps us to consider the evidence and questions around the birth of Jesus. It's called Did It Really Happen? The Birth of Jesus. Why not sign up for the course or gift it to a friend? Find out more at premierunbelievable.com.
So, Lee, as a neurosurgeon, you have the brain in your hands. You're touching the brain, so you've got a
Yeah.
lot of first-hand experience of the brain. And given your experience and given the reading you've done, do you think that you can explain us? You can explain me, all of me, explain you, personality, consciousness, all that sort of stuff, just by an appeal to the brain? Or do you think we also need to talk about the soul, the mind, whatever else? What do you think?
Well, I think as a practicing neurosurgeon, my education would have taught me that everything about you comes from your brain. That's kind of the classic neuroscience explanation, is that everything about us, our hopes, dreams, possibilities, potential, habits, everything comes from brain activity. And in that worldview, that materialist worldview, really that eliminates free will. It makes everything just the product of neuronal activity and stuff that's happening in cells in your brain. But when you start practicing neurosurgery, especially when you do something like seizure surgery, for example, or you map somebody's brain, you start finding that people can think about things that can't be mapped to brain activity. And when you start looking at what happens when people have seizures, Wilder Penfield's work was fascinating along these lines. People have seizures where they can sometimes have memories, sometimes have thoughts that happen during the seizures, but they have no abstract thought. Nobody ever has a math seizure where they become insightful about mathematics. They have chaos seizures. Everything is jumbled when brain activity is haywire. But if you start doing brain stimulation on people during awake brain surgery, you can stimulate the parts of the brain, for example, that control the arm movement. And you can tell the patient to move their arm and block them from being able to do so. But when you finish the surgery, they'll tell you that I could tell when you were keeping me from moving my arm, but I wanted to move it. I was thinking about moving it. It was not that my brain just wouldn't let me because you were blocking it electrically. So there's a difference between the things that we think about, which is then mind, and the Bible would call it soul or heart or mind, kind of conflate that. But mind and brain are not the same thing. There's an immaterial aspect to you, to your personality, to the things that you think about. And I had an experience with that shortly after we lost Mitch that actually began sort of the reason why we wrote the book that we're talking about today, and a lot of the research I've been doing over the last 12 years. Our office in 2013 was on the university campus at Auburn, Alabama, where they have a school called Auburn University. And they were doing functional MRI research there. And that's a type of MRI where you can put somebody in a scanner, and it's not just a picture of their brain that you get, but you can actually see what their brain is doing when they're moving or thinking or performing certain tasks. And so we went down to watch this research about a month after Mitch had died. And they put a woman in the scanner, Luke, and they basically turned the machine on, and you could see what her brain was doing when she wasn't particularly thinking about anything. She was just lying there, and you could see what parts of the brain were getting blood flow and what neurotransmitters were doing. And then they had headphones on her so they could communicate with her. And they said, Mrs. Johnson, think about the hardest day of your life, the worst thing you've ever experienced. Just call to mind your worst memory. And you saw her sort of wrinkle up her forehead and think about something. And then quickly after that, her brain began to light up in the areas that process fear and emotion, like the amygdala and limbic system, the parts that are related to fear and fight or flight. And then shortly after that, her physiology began to change. Her heart rate went up and her blood pressure went up and her respiratory rate went up. And we saw her getting uncomfortable and afraid of what she was thinking about and what her brain was doing. And then they said, okay, stop thinking about that and now start thinking about your best memory, the favorite thing you can recall. And again, she sort of wrinkled up her forehead, and then her brain began to change in what it was doing in response to what she was thinking about. Her frontal lobes came online, or cingulate gyrus and insula came online, and the amygdala calmed down, and parts that are related to happiness and processing happy memories. And then her blood pressure came down, and her heart rate came down, and her breathing slowed. And we saw basically, again, she chose to get into that metacognitive state where you're thinking about something instead of feeling something. And what she thought about changed what her brain was doing in real time. And what her brain did changed what her body was doing in real time. And that's very much what that passage in Philippians chapter 4 talks about, which is if you want to be less anxious, be grateful. Like, choose to think different thoughts and you'll have less anxiety. And that's very consistent with 21st century imaging research across the board now. There's very clear evidence now that people's thoughts and their brain activity are not the same thing. And so I think that argues very strongly, backs up my neurosurgery experience and backs up what Scripture's always said. Very strong evidence that mind and brain are not the same thing. One is immaterial, one is material, and they communicate with each other and they're related to each other, but they're distinct entities.
So what would the materialist say to that? Well, he or she say, right, but the thoughts are just wrapped up in the brain. Okay, so you've got these thoughts. You're like, okay, what was this horrible memory? Okay, well, I'm tapping in, thinking, using my brain. I'm tapping into parts of my brain, thinking about those memories, and it's lighting up other parts of my brain because I'm afraid, etc. The materialist might say there's no need to go beyond that? We can explain these thoughts, these change of thoughts, and then as a consequence, the brain activity just by the material brain.
Well, you can think that, and this is where we get into the difference between science and what I would call scientism, really. So the difference between worldview and science. So if you're a materialist and you believe what you've been taught, that science has proved that human consciousness comes from brain,
Hmm.
then you'll think the kinds of things you just said. But if
Hmm.
you actually look at the research, there is
Hmm.
no data to suggest that consciousness arises from brain activity. That there's just no data to suggest that. There's a lot of evidence to the contrary if you look at it, but there's nobody that's ever been able to show, okay, this type of thought comes from this part of the brain. So what we see is the opposite almost. Andrew Newberg at University of Pennsylvania has done some really interesting research on what happens to the brains of people who pray and meditate for a few minutes every day.
Mhm.
And the old theory was, Richard Dawkins and others have written about this idea of the God neuron, that there's some people are predisposed to have religious tendencies and that they have certain brain areas that are more active. And because of that, they believe in things and it helps them evolutionarily to believe in a God and that sort of thing. That was the theory. But what Newberg showed was that you can take anybody off the street, who atheist, agnostic, religious or not, and you can measure their brains in a functional MRI scanner, and then you can teach them a mindfulness, meditation, and prayer habit for 10 or 15 minutes a day for about 6 weeks. And when they do that, the hippocampus of their brain, which is about emotional resilience and memory processing, gets on average about 22% bigger and more active after 6 weeks of meditative prayer and practice. So that's not that their brain was structurally bigger in that area and that made them want to pray. It was that praying and meditating created that improvement in the part of the brain that's related to resilience and emotional stability, which then if you tie that back to what Philippians 4 said, that don't be anxious, be grateful instead, and you'll be less anxious and guarded, and your heart and your mind will be guarded and you'll have peace. And now you're looking at the part of the brain that gives you emotional resilience and guarding, getting more robust when you are grateful and prayerful and mindful. And so that would suggest then that you can make a decision with the immaterial part of your brain or part of your mind, and that will impact the material physical part of your brain and make it do things differently than it had done before, which will then produce a different outcome in your neurochemistry and your psychiatric health. And so I think it's the idea that everything is just brain activity is a product of materialist worldview, and it's not a product of neuroscience.
And how does the neuroscience community respond to this sort of research, the books that you've mentioned? Do they have time for it, or are they just sort of stuck in their ways?
Well, it's changing over time. People are starting to acknowledge that they can't explain everything that they're learning via traditional materialist neuroscience. But still, there's this strong effort. And again, it goes back to the difference between science and worldview. I mean, if you believe something strongly despite the evidence showing the contrary, that's faith. That's not science, right? And you can have faith in science, but it's still faith. It's not science. So science would be this process of using a method to try to get closer to truth, right? So say I have a hypothesis or something I think may be true, something I've observed and noticed, and I'm trying to figure out how it works. And I'm going to test that and devise experiments to test it. And then when I get results from the testing, I'm going to go back and revise my hypothesis and change it if the data doesn't support it. What we see sometimes with traditional science or people with materialist worldviews is that in spite of evidence that shows that the original hypothesis wasn't correct, they just say, well, we haven't figured it out yet, but we know this is true. And that steps out of being science and starts stepping into worldview. So I think that we're seeing a move now where more and more people are talking about consciousness and free will and mind in the literature and still not being able to explain it, but at least acknowledging that it's there. Because the traditional neuroscientists would have said that there's no such thing as mind, that everything that you think is your thought process is just and sort of an epiphenomenon of neuronal activity. It's an illusion. And so they're definitely losing the grip on that argument, that now people are starting to acknowledge, yeah, there is something that's different than brain activity. We just don't know what it is yet.
Fascinating. Earlier you mentioned that when you, 4.5 years after Iraq, you experienced these flashbacks, these memories. You'd sort of zone out for a while, and the language you used was this stuff was, I guess, trapped in your unconscious, and it basically came out 4.5 years later. Now, I have wondered whether, and I haven't actually done the work on this, but I've wondered whether appeal to the mind or the soul will help us explain this sort of phenomenon. How we have what we're conscious of. I'm conscious of having this conversation now, but there's all sorts of stuff in me somewhere in my psyche that I have memory. When I go back home to Northern Ireland, it brings up memories and feelings and stuff that's there, but I'm not conscious of it now. So I've wondered whether an appeal to an immaterial mind or soul could help explain that. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think so, because humans have this gift. Again, I use words like gift and design because I'm a believer, but humans have an ability that no other being, created entity or evolved entity, or however you want to think about it, nothing else has the ability to engage in what we call selective attention. Like, you can decide to think about one thing and not think about something else. And I think that's the key to how we suppress memories and how we decide to we're going to compartmentalize some things and we're not going to deal with them. And that, for me, it was practical when I got home from the war. Like, I really had to go and start a business. I had to go and reconnect with my kids. I didn't have time to deal with what I went through in Iraq at that time. And so my selective attention was able to say, okay, I am not going to think about that stuff right now. And so I can just wall it off. And then sometime later, at a moment of not paying attention or not being fully engaged, some outside event can trigger something that your brain tells you is familiar. Like, hey, I feel danger. I see a sight that reminds me of a time when I was endangered. And then that barricade that you've made in your mind breaks down and allows those memories to flood back in, and you begin to decide to pay attention to it at that time. So I think it does speak to the immaterial, this ability to engage in metacognition and selective attention. And those two things together, I think, explain a lot of our ability to not engage and deal with certain things for a long period of time sometimes.
What is it about the mind or soul being immaterial that helps? Because obviously you're very, 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 very familiar with the material of the brain. What is it about something being immaterial that could help explain these various phenomena that we're talking about?
Well, I think if it was all material, I think if everything about you was just the result of neuronal activity, there's no way for you to explain why some neurons fire sometimes and other ones don't. Like, if everything about you was stored in some sort of neuronal activity and the brain's firing all the time, you wouldn't have any ability to choose when those things come on and come off. And so I think the immaterial mind gives us a whole other explanation of this ability to say, it's not practical or helpful for me to deal with this right now, so I'm going to lock it away and I'm going to deal with it later, or I'm never going to deal with it at all. And so I think that makes sense to me anyway.
That's fascinating. Yeah, it's really helpful to hear that from a specialist like yourself. So when we're thinking about modern brain imaging, more appealing to your specialism, what is it telling us about the ability of, say, the mind or the soul to bring about structural change in the brain? You've already talked about prayer. Do you want to speak more to that? Because it obviously ties into your recent book.
Yeah, in fact, I think this is where we have hope. If you're just the product of your brain activity, and if your brain activity, like we thought for many years, is relatively stuck, if your brain's kind of the way it's going to be, and I think that's a common thing that we're taught now. Like, if you have the wrong family, the wrong genetics, the wrong circumstances, you're sort of stuck with the brain that you have, and it can get worse, but it's hard for it to get better. You're kind of stuck with that. If that's all there is, it's kind of a hopeless situation because you don't have any control. But what we now very clearly see in the research is that as soon as you think about one thing and not another thing, your brain begins to prepare to automate that new thought process or to carry out a new set of instructions. Your brain's always just listening for you to tell it what to care about. And so there's a part of your brain called the reticular activating system that's a whole bunch of neuronal networks in your brainstem that, among other things, basically serves as a filtering mechanism to look out for what you tell it to look out for. And this is why If you decide when you first wake up in the morning that you're going to have a bad day, for example, that all of a sudden everything around you reinforces the idea that it's a bad day, right? Everything you see is negative. And if you decide you're going to have a good day, then all of a sudden you start seeing sunrises and flowers and beautiful things, and you start having a good day. And that's sort of the basis of what's happening in the reticular activating system. Is it says, okay, I'm going to show you a reality that reinforces what you're looking for. And so we know now there are structural changes, genes that get turned on and off, and microtubules and different parts of dendritic connections between neurons that actually sever and reconnect to other neurons within seconds to minutes of you making a decision to think about one thing and not another. And then if you begin to reinforce that over time, to think that same new thought or repeat that same new intention over and over, that new pathway eventually replaces the old one and basically becomes the new automated pathway. So it's really true that people can change, but it starts with what you're thinking about repetitively. There's some interesting research that shows that about 90% of the things that most of us think over and over every day is the same set of things that we thought about the previous day. And if that sounds stunning to you, you can just test it. So write down at the end of the day, write down the 3 most common thoughts that you had that day, and then do that for 10 or 12 days in a row. And it'll be about the same. You think about your marriage, your bills, your obligations, the stuff you're worried about, whatever it is. You think about those things over and over again. And now that we know that what you think about is what determines the structural, basically function and form of how your brain is behaving, that means if you keep thinking the same thoughts all the time, you keep making the same brain all the time. And so if you're anxious, you're depressed, you're worried, you're stressed, and you feel like you can't ever change that, it's because you're thinking things and automating things in your brain that keep you stuck in that situation all the time, structurally. So when I talk about this idea of self-brain surgery, the whole idea is that when you choose to think about different things than you have previously thought about, you change from something harmful to something more hopeful, for example, you begin to make literal structural changes in your brain that are very much like the ones I make in the operating room when I choose to put a knife in your brain and cut out a tumor. Like I'm intentionally changing how your brain works for the purpose of trying to help your life in some way. And so you can literally do the same thing with your thoughts now. And it's not metaphor. It's like a literal structural change that begins within seconds to minutes of you changing your thought processes. So if you had that map of the 10 things that you commonly or 3 things that you commonly think about every day, and you just decided to change them for a few days, you would find that your amount of hope, your amount of agency, the things you think about, the possibilities you see for your life will begin to change in ways that you can measure.
I want to get into that. Before I do, I just want to bring up one more objection. Phineas Gage, you'll be very familiar with the case of Phineas Gage. I don't know, it was like over 100 years ago. I think he was in America. He was working on the railways, and he was putting these massive bolts or nails into the ground, over a couple of feet long. And there was a misfire, and this big bolt, an inch or 2 wide, went right up through his head, through his brain, and out the other side. Amazingly, he survives. And but quite soon his personality changes. He becomes a little more irritable, angry, unpleasant. So the materialists come up and they say, well, here, this is just proof that all there is to you and me is our brain. And if you change our brain, you're going to change me or you. Some said Phineas Gage was like a different man after this accident had taken place. What do you say to that?
Well, it's a fascinating example of how brain and mind work together. I mean, obviously, if your brain's unhealthy, you're going to have a hard time processing things and being who you're supposed to be. And Phineas Gage had an injury to his prefrontal cortex on the dominant side, which changed his personality quite dramatically. So we know that brain activity and the function of your brain does affect your mind's ability to interface with it. But it's also been shown very clearly, 21st century research and people like Dr. Norman Doidge that wrote the book, The Brain That Changes Itself, for example, has shown that with proper rehab, that parts of the brain that are lost to stroke can be rewired, and other parts of the brain can actually be taught with mental effort and proper cognitive rehab to take over functions that were thought to be permanently lost. And so you've shown in people that had strokes that produced weakness on one side of the body and permanent brain damage on that area, that neurons can be sort of thought to drive in to repopulate different parts of the brain, and that function can be regained over time. And so that means that you can change how your brain structurally works with proper rehab and understanding and mental command. And so there's clearly a need to have a healthy functioning brain if you're going to be a healthy functioning person. But the mental side of it is now very clearly been shown to have controlling influence on what happens to the brain even after it's been damaged. So Phineas Gage lived in an era and a time when there was no such thing as physical therapy and cognitive rehab and all of those things. So he had a damaged brain and didn't know that there was anything that could be done about it. Now we see people all the time with strokes and head injuries that can be rehabbed and regain function that they've lost, even if that part of the brain that used to control that particular function has been lost.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's a bit like, so the soul is like the message that's been put out, but the brain is like the radio signal that's just a bit crackly. So the soul, the mind is still there, but the brain it's having trouble getting through, if you like, something like that. Yeah, fascinating. Right. Okay, we're going to take another break, and then we're going to get into this idea of self-brain surgery with Dr. Lee Warren.
The mind and brain are connected, but the scientific data doesn't enable you to establish the nature of that connection or the relationship.
Just because science can't demonstrate that physical processes and mental processes are the same thing, that in and of itself doesn't give you any evidence that that's not the case either.
Some people talk about seeing deceased relatives and communicating with them.
This idea of floating up out of your body and watching things happen and being able to describe it afterwards, that could be formed in your imaginative mind.
Conscious experience and brain processes are two fundamentally different things.
I wonder if we're talking about...
Would you like me to go out for a bit? You guys seem really happy.
So the new book is called The Life-Changing Art of Self-Brain Surgery, and you're going to lay out some more of it for us. So far, I'm hearing that our mind, our thoughts can basically bring about changes in our brain. Now, I guess my first thought is this CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy? In what way is it different from CBT?
So cognitive behavioral therapy is a technique. It's a set of techniques that is based in brain behavior. Like it's based in understanding what your brain is doing and trying to manage it. And it's a therapeutic technique. And I would say self-brain surgery is more of a lifestyle practice that I want to be forever, the way that you tend to operate your nervous system, not managing a specific thing here and there, but to change the way you think about how your mind and brain interact with one another and the amount of control and sort of agency that you actually have and how your life turns out. And so it's not, I need to learn how to think about this particular issue differently, or I need to learn how to manage my OCD differently, but rather I'm in charge of changing what my brain is and how my brain behaves. And I can then change how my life turns out from moment to moment and thought to thought. And I can use that in the context of therapy. If I need therapy and I need a professional to help me, I'm still empowered to be the operating surgeon that sort of manage my own system. Because if you don't manage your nervous system, it's going to manage you, basically. That's what we've learned. Like if you focus on what you feel, if you focus on your automatic thoughts, they become more real and more powerful in your life. And now we know that if you can actually decide that you're going to take command of those things, your brain will respond. Everybody's brain will respond to better commands and instructions from your mind. So you can manage your life all the time with this kind of thought process, even if you need additional help from a professional to learn how to operate it. So I think it's cognitive behavioral therapy is a tool and self-brain surgery is a lifestyle.
So let's think about this then. Say somebody is struggling with well, should we say with depression or anxiety or something like that, how would they go about making the sort of changes that you're recommending? Would they be writing out the thoughts that they're having, trying to find the top 3 thoughts each day and thinking about changing them? What would you suggest they do?
The first thing is to remember that you have the ability to engage in what we call metacognition. So it's been shown with really good research that an alarming amount of the things that pop into your head, the automatic thoughts that you have, that all of us hear in our own voice, and the automatic things that we feel, so the anxieties, the phobias, the things that pop up that we feel, an alarming amount of those things are not true. They just are repetitive things that are based on prior experiences or a story that our hippocampus is trying to make sense out of our environment or something. So an alarming number of the things that pop into your head every day aren't true. They're not based on anything real. And we know that the brain doesn't have the ability to discern between something that's real and something that we're just ruminating on or imagining. Your brain's going to respond the same way with the same physiological responses and all of that if the problem is real and an immediate real threat, or if it's just an imagined ruminating fear or worry. And so if you're aware of that, and you're aware that a lot of the things you think and feel automatically are not true, then you need to develop this sort of response of saying, I'm no longer going to automatically react to things that pop into my head. Instead, I'm going to think about those things for a moment and be curious about them and ask myself questions of them. Is this really true? Is this thing I'm feeling really based on something that's happening, or am I just worrying about, am I just in a environment that reminds me of a previous experience? And so if you can get into that space, it's where you're questioning your thoughts and feelings instead of just reacting to them, then you have an opportunity to get out of that fear-based part of your brain, the amygdala, that's really not very good at anything except fight or flight. And you can get your frontal lobes engaged, the part of your brain that's actually designed to help you make better decisions and be reasonable and rational and all those things. And you can start thinking about your situation with the better, bigger, more robust part of your brain. And you can then give your brain better mind down commands that are going to be processed in a better part of your brain to say, I want to respond to this situation more effectively than I have previously reacted to it. And so I think if you're anxious, for example, if you start to feel some anxiety, let's just say you get a letter that's from the government, right? And your first feeling is that you get anxious. Your hair stands up on the back of your neck and your heart rate goes up and you think you might be in some kind of trouble because you're getting a notice from the government, right? Or it could be that you feel those things. Your heart rate goes up and your hair stands up on the back of your neck and your mouth gets dry because you've been anticipating a letter that's going to give you some kind of good news that you've been waiting for from the government, okay? So you've got this letter in your hand and you're having this set of physiological responses that feel like anxiety or potentially excitement, but notice that the things you feel when you're excited and when you're anxious are the same things. It's your heart rate goes up, your mouth gets dry, your hair stands up on the back of your neck. The same things happen. And what makes one anxiety and one excitement is the story you're telling yourself in your head about what you're about to find out, right? Not the actual thing itself, because you haven't opened the envelope yet. And now you look at the envelope again and you see that it was addressed to your neighbor and it shouldn't have been in your mailbox at all. So it wasn't true. You were feeling all this stuff and it was either excitement or it was anxiety, but it wasn't based on anything true. So that should tell all of us that our brains can make us perceive some things that aren't based in something in the physical world that's real. They're just based on the story that we're telling ourselves. And so if you're aware of that reality, that phenomenon that you can feel something very strongly that isn't true, if you're aware of that, then that should tell you that developing this metacognitive practice where you step out of the experience of what you're feeling and thinking and instead manage it with a decision-making, questioning, curiosity, then you'll find that you start making better decisions and then you'll begin to have better outcomes. So I think that's just one example of what I call in the book, the feelings aren't facts, they're chemical events in my brain, right? You need to develop this belief that not everything you think and feel is real.
So go with your thoughts rather than go with your feelings. So you're having this moment of anxiety about this letter, rather than just be taken away by what you're feeling, just pause a moment, try and step back and think about it. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah. So sort of get curious about what you're feeling and say, wait, do I really need to be afraid? Do I really need to make a decision here? Or do I need to open the envelope and find out what's inside of it? Or do I need to look at it again and realize it wasn't addressed to me? Like some of us feel something and we run away. We engage the feeling and we get into fight or flight and we start catastrophizing and worrying and calling our mom or doing something in response to that feeling, rather than finding out what's true and real in the moment and then deciding how to appropriately respond to it. So yeah, thinking, not reacting to the automatic thought, but thinking about the things that we're thinking and feeling and deciding how to respond based on what's true.
And what's interesting there is you're saying that as soon as you start to do that, and this is where you have a huge amount of insight, as soon as you start to do that, you're actually using a different part of your brain.
That's right.
So you're moving away from, in this case, the fear part of your brain, probably explaining it the wrong way,
That's
to
right.
a different part of the brain that's going to mean more sort of level thinking perspective rather than anxiety. That's what
Yeah,
you mean by
exactly
sort of
right.
starting to rewire it.
That's right. And then the way your brain works is if you get into a habit of doing that, getting curious and investigating what you're feeling instead of reacting to it, that will become your baseline behavior over time. You'll get better at being curious about your thinking than you were previously good at reacting to your thinking. And so your brain will respond and reward you by making these good choices if you keep reinforcing them. That's why I call it surgery. It's like you're intentionally making a structural change in how your brain's going to work, and that will become your default state eventually if you keep doing it.
So the surgery is, I've got a feeling I'm low or I'm a bit worried. The surgery is then, I'm going to be proactive and think about this rather than just going with the flow.
That's right. That's one example of it. Yeah.
So I want to tie this together because I guess what some people might say is, let's go back to your experience in Iraq. You came back and I believe you said that if you talk about or process the experience immediately, that can help. You were very busy setting up a business, working with your family. So it was 4.5 years later, it comes out. I guess, might somebody say at that time, what you need to do is actually work through what you've been left with rather than just doing some sort of thinking about it in a different way and getting on with things. Is there a sense that with some of these kind of more traumatic experiences, you need to sit down and sit with those feelings for a while?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's an important point because things like grief and major trauma and all of that, these aren't things that you can immediately manage and dispense of in a few seconds. Like they need to be processed and handled appropriately. And grieving especially needs to be, it's a process that you need to go through. And so what I'm discussing here is not to ignore or deny the things that are real that we've gone through, or even things that we just feel deeply. I mean, they all need to be understood and investigated and be curious about them. They just shouldn't have controlling power over how your life plays out. And in order to get to that place where you can manage them appropriately, you just need to be aware that trauma, for example, doesn't have the inherent power to create a future for you. It's the responses that you choose after trauma happens that create the future for you. Gabor Mate and others have written extensively about that the good news about trauma is that it's never been the event itself that creates what happens to you. It's the choices that you make and the responses that you choose, even if you're not aware of all of them. And so once you're aware that you've chosen a response to your situation that isn't helping you, then you can use that metacognitive tool that we've been talking about to develop a different response. It doesn't negate what you've been through. Like I will always have lost my son, but if it was the fact that I lost my son that had the inherent power to change my future, I would truly be hopeless. I wouldn't have any ability to change that because he's already gone. But it turns out that it's the way that I'm living and the things that I'm thinking now, that's what creates the reality of how that trauma has impacted me, not the trauma itself. And so once you understand that, you have tremendous opportunity to make whatever you're dealing with more manageable for yourself.
It's fascinating. So say you're going through grief or coming back from war, is there a sense that even if you sit down and process that, you or whoever else were to sit down and process that, you'll come out the other end of it, and I know there's a sense that it never leaves us, but you come out the other end and you still might need to do some of this work of sort of, you call it self-surgery, just resetting. So I've gone through this very difficult experience, whatever it is happens to, different things happen to us. I've processed it, gone through the grief, whatever, but there still could be some, cleared out the unconscious, if you like, but there's still some resetting needed. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I mean, because these things are lifelong, they change the arc of our life forever. Like, right, my son's always going to be gone. It's always going to be a hole in our family and all those things. And from time to time, they do come back and have to be processed and managed again. And every time that happens, you have to decide, am I going to descend into this? Am I going to let this become who I am and redefine my life again? Or am I going to sort of try to process it in a healthy way and control what my brain does in response to it?
Fascinating. How do you tie this into the Christian faith? Do you think that the brain working in this sort of way is what you'd expect given Christian assumptions? Do you think that this approach to dealing with difficult times, this sort of self-surgery approach, has theological or biblical support?
I think so, tremendously. I mean, there's a ton of scripture that talks about how the things we feel aren't very reliable. You know, there's a verse in Jeremiah that says the heart is desperately wicked, and who can trust it? Like you have all these verses that talk about how the things you feel and think aren't particularly reliable, and you need to have a process of managing them. That 2 Corinthians 10:5 talks about taking all your thoughts captive. Like your thoughts are going to lead you astray if you're not careful with them. Ephesians chapter 4 in the New Testament talks about how people can have futile thinking that leads them into all kinds of desperate behaviors, and that the solution to that is to be renewed in the attitude of your mind. And Romans chapter 12 talks about, don't conform to how the world wants you to think and feel and behave, but be transformed in the renewing of your mind. So there's all this scripture that separates mind and brain, heart, soul, and mind, kind of conflated in scriptural terms, and how our bodies respond to the things that we think about. Jesus said a number of times, like, as you think in your heart, so are you. Jesus didn't say that. That's an Old Testament verse. But Jesus said, what comes out of the mouth is from the heart. Like the things that you do and say in your life come out of what you're thinking about. And Jesus also said, be really careful with how you listen. Be very careful how you hear. Be very careful what you see, because it affects what comes out of you. And so I think the idea of self-brain surgery is the participation of what God wants to do in our lives. It's our role in how we carry out his assistance and his help in living the lives that are supposed to honor him. Romans 12:1 talks about presenting your body as a living sacrifice, as an act of worship, and your brain is part of your body. So we're supposed to try to use our brains and our bodies in ways that honor him. So I think it's very consistent with scripture.
And for people who are listening or watching who aren't Christian, maybe they're curious, can this still work for them? Is this just this sort of the facts of the mind and the brain? Does it work for them?
Absolutely. And I think it's for everybody, because even if you are a hardcore materialist and you think everything about you is the result of neuronal activity, you still can acknowledge the research that says when you think about how your brain works in this particular way, like if I choose my thoughts carefully, if I direct them in a different way, I make better structural changes in my brain, I have a better neurochemistry environment, and I have a better outcome in my life. If you just think about it and operate your brain in that way, even if you don't think there's anything to this mind-brain business, you're still going to have a better outcome. And so I think learning to operate your nervous system in the most efficient way possible, and I won't use the word design there, because if you don't believe it was designed, it just evolved this way, you still can operate it according to how the research says it should be operated in the most optimal way. And so if you want to have a more robust and happier life, learning how to operate your brain in this particular way will be of immense value to you. And then I would just throw you a little challenge, a little caveat, like if it seems like stuff the Bible said a long time ago about how humans are best to flourish, if it seems like every time you operate as if that were true, it turns out to work, then maybe that should get you into a place where you say, I wonder why it all seems to line up like that. Like, be a good scientist, be curious about it, ask questions of it. And if it seems like it keeps working, maybe it's because it's true. So that would justify asking questions that science can't answer alone.
There's a lot of talk these days about neurodiversity. I was actually speaking with some friends of mine not too long ago who were both saying that they have taken sort of an ADHD test as, 37-year-olds, whatever. There's a lot of talk about ADHD, anxiety and depression. The stats show that these conditions are on the rise, have been on the rise. I believe there's dramatic rise, particularly amongst young people since 2010, 2011. Jonathan Haidt's work has documented that. How does your work feed into this rise in these conditions? Is there a sense that we can take control and we don't need to label ourselves with these conditions, or should we be, thinking that there is this serious rise in conditions going on in Western society?
I think the first thing is we need to be very careful at diagnosing things based on stuff that people say on Instagram or on the internet. So we have this tremendous number of people who self-diagnose themselves as having ADHD or neurodiversity or whatever because their friends all say that they're weird, or their friends all say that they act a certain way, so they must be, whatever. And we all think we're qualified to call somebody else a narcissist or to call somebody else whatever. And so be very careful in labeling yourself or your children or your friends or other people with diagnoses if you're not qualified to make those diagnoses. So first of all, and the reason you should be careful is because we know it's very clear now that the more you focus on something and the more you tell yourself something, the more real that thing becomes. So if you focus on, I'm an anxious person, that's just who I am, it's how I always will be, your brain will begin to filter and try to reinforce that, to prove that to you and to protect you from reacting, from the things that you feel in regards to that. So you can make something become more true in your life by over-focusing on it. And there's been really good research now that kids, for example, who are put into therapy for sort of preventive purposes, or their parents just drop them off at the therapist and say, help my kid figure out what their life's about. Those kids become progressively more anxious. The more they sit and think about, hey, tell me what you're feeling. The more they think about their feelings, the more amplified those feelings become. And so I think the whole self-brain surgery piece is just to say that whatever is true about how your brain works at a baseline, you can learn to manage that in a more optimal way. But the first thing is to not focus on the feeling or the behavior, but to focus on what you want of your life. So a better question for your kids is not how do you feel, how do you want to feel? Because if you say, hey, what do you want for your life? Do you want to feel happy? Do you want to feel like you have opportunity and agency and hope? If you want to feel that, then let's focus on steps we would need to take for you to have that life, rather than here's all the ways I'm limited. I need to focus on that and try to avoid anything that triggers me or makes me feel bad. Like if you flip the script and say, I want to create a brain that's going to support my desire to be happier and healthier and more whole, you can do that. It's very clear now that you can overcome anxiety and depression and lots of other things, not always without professional help, but by focusing on the path you want to take rather than on the path you believe you're limited to.
Let's try ADHD briefly. So I don't have ADHD, but my friends have described it to me now that they're not experts in it either. So you might just say that this isn't the right way to think about it, but they talk about it as a struggle to focus. So there's always just this sense of distraction, and just struggling when people are talking, just struggling to really focus. But then if they really do get interested in something, then they can be gone for like 3 hours. So in a sense, it makes people quite suitable, they claim, to something like academia, because if that's your thing, you're gone and you're in it. But then you're chatting to someone over lunch and you're kind of a bit distracted. Now, I don't experience that myself. But what would you say to that? I mean, would you be saying we need to think about this in a different way? Or would you be saying, oh, actually, yeah, that's the sort of thing that you might need to get help for or to get medication for? What's your view of that?
Well, again, I would just caution people to not self-diagnose, especially something serious like ADHD. There's a real disorder where some people really do have struggles and need professional help and sometimes medication or sometimes therapy. But there's probably 100 people for every one that really has a diagnosis that have just accepted that as a label from a teacher or a parent or friends, or have just decided that that's what's wrong with them. And so I would say if you focus on your life being limited by a particular diagnosis, that will become more true for you, for sure. There's no doubt about that. But if you say, hey, it doesn't serve me well to be easily distracted, so I need to start beginning to try to develop some strategies to maintain a better focus. And you can start to build a brain that will help you focus, and you can get professional help to do that. But you can also decide that that particular behavior or proclivity isn't serving you well, and you want to work around it. So rather than accepting the idea that you're limited or you're stuck because of this thing, rather tell your brain, I want to build a life that is going to include the ability to work around that thing. And then the other thing is sometimes things that we think are diagnoses that are limiting are actually sort of superpowers if they're used properly.
Yeah.
And so ADHD is one of those. Like you want somebody who can hyper focus and be profoundly vigilant for a long period of time. If you're talking about rocket science or brain surgery, like you want those people to be able to lock in and do that thing. So don't automatically think that something that somebody else thinks is a liability for you is actually a liability for you, because it might actually be a tool that you can use to be more successful in your life. So just don't accept labels, don't self-diagnose, and don't give up on yourself, because sometimes the things you think are hindrances can actually be helpful to you.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Lee. So the book is The Life-Changing Art of Self-Brain Surgery. Is there anything else you want to say about it as we wrap up?
I just think it would be helpful to people. There's 15 operations in the back that cover very specific areas like anxiety and grief and depression. And I think it'll be a helpful tool to anybody, regardless of their belief system. And it's been a great joy to talk to you today, Luke. Thank you.
Dr. Lee Warren, thank you so much for your time. To our viewers and listeners, thank you, and we'll be back in 2 weeks' time. That's it for today's Premier Unbelievable, the interview, where we bring you deep conversations at the intersection of culture, theology, and personal story. We'd love to know who you'd like to hear from next and what questions you'd like me to ask. So get in touch at unbelievable@premier.org.uk or follow us on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube. I'm Luke Martin, and I'll see you next time.